In San Francisco, and this is Bloomberg Technology. Coming up in the next hour, messy. That is how one analyst describes Uber's earnings in the second quarter. After a revenue miss, shares are off almost 14% from their IPO price. Plus, fanning trade flames, President Trump suggests next month's talk with China may not happen. But one of his trade advisors, Peter Navarro, says Chinese negotiators will head to Washington. What all the back and forth means for the looming tech Cold War. And in the wake of recent mass shootings, President Trump wants federal agencies to work with social media companies to stamp out hate. Should they be policed by the government? We'll ask Homeland Security Committee Chair Congressman Benny Thompson of Mississippi. But first, to our top story, Uber shares continue to fall after a sales miss at a $5.2 billion loss in the second quarter, much of it due to stock-based compensation associated with the IPO in May. Uber CEO tried to reassure investors, saying losses will come down over the next 2 years. For more, I want to bring in Bloomberg Tech's Eric Newcomer. So, Eric, we were expecting a big loss this quarter tied to the IPO. Why such a dramatic reaction?
You know, honestly, I think the stock reaction had to do with the revenue miss, which, you know, if you're going to lose that much money, you have to keep growing. I mean, obviously, you know, a $5 billion plus net loss is huge. And that has to do with stock-based comp tied to the IPO. But obviously, Uber still loses a ton of money sort of regularly, though it did beat expectations for its adjusted loss figure.
Are investors generally buying it that this is a once-in-a-lifetime of a company thing?
You know, I think that narrative is challenged. You know, I think if they were fully buying that, you know, we'd see Uber above its IPO price. I think analysts right now remain very optimistic about Uber. You know, many of them have buy ratings for the company, but, you know, there's a lot of short interest in this stock, and I think there's a lot of skepticism that just because the gross bookings are huge and they can continue to grow somewhat, that they're ever going to be able to outgrow these losses.
Meantime, Uber CEO Dara Khosrowshahi talked about how he believes the competitive environment in ride-sharing in the U.S., at least, is going to start to stabilize, and then they're just going to lean in to their Uber Eats business. Take a listen to what he had to say.
The competitive environment and our position in the ride-sharing space continues to be stable to improve. We will take some of that improvement to continue to lean into our Eats business, where we see plenty of competition and significant capital investment, but incredible potential.
So the competition for Uber not dying down anytime soon, Eric. You know, we saw Lyft shares actually rise after their results, a much smaller business, but also a much more focused business. And right. I wonder if just the breadth and uncertainty around Uber is going to be a long-term deterrent.
I think this is why things are so happy for Lyft right now. I mean, people across the board still have questions about the ride-hailing business, how it makes sense. Lyft still loses a substantial amount of money. But compared to Uber, which needs to use money from ride-hailing to fund food delivery someday. I mean, that's basically what Dara is saying here, that food delivery is going to be a big cost center because you see companies like DoorDash, which spent, you know, $400 million buying caviar. It's just a huge investment area. So Uber just has this problem that it has so many money-losing businesses that its financials are going to look pretty red.
So talk to us about Uber Eats and the ensuing wars that Uber will face there. I mean, the delivery business is super competitive as well.
Yeah, I think on the one hand, food delivery has been a good way for Uber to expand in countries that weren't hospitable to ride-hailing. You know, they talk a lot about Japan. I think there are definitely markets where they have a super strong position, but there are others like India where they've been very challenged. And generally, I mean, they lost the U.S. to DoorDash. So I do think it's a case where Uber can't say, like in ride-hailing, we're the market leader. You know, most of the places we operate, it's you know, they're working to sort of fight for position still. And so, you know, it's an exciting category that I don't think, you know, investors would say they should abandon, but it just makes explaining their financial story, especially when they don't very clearly break out their ride-hailing comparison with Lyft, it makes it more challenging.
So what are you going to be watching for over the next couple of quarters? They did give more of a forecast than they had before.
Sure, I think, we're going to be watching to see, okay, are these losses really one time, or do we keep seeing these weird events that make their losses on a GAAP basis humongous? Second, we're just curious, revenue needs to keep growing reasonably, and it's about the pace of growth and whether they can hold market share against competitors and keep growing. So it's, will the losses come down? Are the losses, on a path downward? And then, does revenue keep growing? It's pretty simple. It's just, they have to deliver on it.
All right. Well, Eric Newcomer, I know you'll continue to cover all the drama for us. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Now, to another story we continue to watch. Huawei has offered the first glimpse of its in-house software that may someday replace Google's Android operating system. This is an important step toward reducing its reliance on American technology. To begin with, the open source software will skip smartphones and instead find its way into everything from cars and watches to personal computers by 2020. To discuss, we are joined by our Bloomberg Tech executive editor, Tom Giles. And because Huawei is on this U.S. blacklist, Google cannot supply the most updated Android operating system to Huawei, which is on all Huawei phones. Is this new operating system any good?
We don't know. Is the short answer. There's so little we know about it. There's so little we know about whether, does it work? What are the apps that are going to be working with it? Just how reliable is it? Huawei has made some interesting claims about it's faster. They've said that it's more secure than Android. Pretty outlandish claims for something that's not been proven, that's just not widely available. There's just so little we know about it. And rolling out software, an operating system to millions of phones millions of devices is not the kind of thing that you do overnight.
Well, and perhaps that's why they're skipping phones initially. We do know that, and that it's called Harmony OS. That's
right. And they've been investing a lot of money in it, putting a lot of resources, getting a lot of developers to help them work on it. But so little is known about it. And so, the idea is that we're going to make this available to other devices as we roll out 5G, as we do the whole Internet of Things, make that available to people. But it's not going to be available on devices. In the meantime, U.S. is putting all these limits on whether and to what extent Google can make Android available for Huawei. And they've already derailed the company's efforts to become the world's largest smartphone maker, right? They were on track to do that. There was a lot of fanfare around that, a lot of expectation, and bam, along comes the Trump administration and its sanctions against Huawei.
Meantime, trade tensions continuing to ratchet up. President Trump saying he's fine having the talks, he's fine not having the talks, and also saying this today about Huawei. Take a listen.
We're not going to do business with Huawei. We're not doing business with them. And I really made the decision. It's much simpler not to do any business with Huawei, so we're not doing business with Huawei. That doesn't mean we won't agree to something if and when we make a trade deal, but we're not going to be doing business with Huawei.
So if you're Huawei or Google, how do you interpret that?
The Trump administration has been flip-flopping so much, initially saying no way, nothing at all, and then backtracking a little bit. Remember in recent weeks saying that we will make exceptions. We know there are some U.S. suppliers, some chip makers, for example, who are really intent on making their products available to Huawei. And we think actually that some of these U.S. manufacturers have found ways around this embargo. Then last night, you'll remember, Bloomberg broke the news that process of filling out applications to sell your components to Huawei, that's on hold. Those applications are sitting on someone's desk in Commerce, and no action is being taken on them. While the Trump administration continues its rhetoric, ratcheting up the pressure, and China in turn retaliates.
All right, well, we're going to talk a little bit more about the China-U.S. trade dispute and its evolution later in the show. Bloomberg's Tom Giles, thank you, as always. Coming up, we'll discuss the fight to end online extremism with the chair of the House Homeland Security Committee. Our conversation with Congressman Benny Thompson next. And if you like Bloomberg News, check us out on the radio, listen on the Bloomberg app, Bloomberg.com, and in the U.S. on Sirius XM. This is Bloomberg. The White House closed the week hosting a summit with various tech associations and companies. The goal? To try and come up with ways to fight online extremism. We know that Twitter and Facebook were there, but details are still emerging. White House Press Secretary Judd Deere tweeted that the conversation focused on how technology can be leveraged to identify potential threats. He added, "We urge internet and social media companies to continue their efforts in addressing violent extremism and helping individuals at risk, and to do so without compromising free speech." Now I'd like to welcome Congressman Benny Thompson. He represents Mississippi's 2nd District, and he's also the chair of the House Homeland Security Committee. He joins us now on the phone from Mississippi. So, Congressman Thompson, how productive do you think a meeting like this can be between the White House and these companies in this climate?
Well, I think it's very difficult. First of all, you need all the stakeholders there. You have to have members of Congress. You have to have the companies. You have to have advocates who monitor systems all the time. We have to have all the players in the room. I just hope that the White House is not trying to give the impression that they are concerned when in reality they have not provided the real leadership to address this issue.
What would that real leadership to address the issue involve?
Well, first of all, again, as I said, you need to bring all the stakeholders together to talk about what the challenges are. There's no question, if you look at election security, there's a challenge around that. We don't have a point person in the White House, a named point person in the White House to address election security. We have a constant churn in our intelligence community with respect to leadership. Right now, as you know, Director Coates is leaving. The person that we thought was going to accept the position has had to resign because the president wanted to put another person in that position. So we have, in a number of very senior positions, a lot of acting people. So you don't have the stability necessary to create the program and opportunities for this matter to be really addressed. From a legislative standpoint, we've had a difficult time getting the companies and this administration to acknowledge that we have a problem. As you know, Russia, we now know, did quite a bit in the last presidential election. For 2 years, everybody in the administration was in denial that Russia did not do anything. Now we know there are some other bad actors, China, Iran, North Korea, who also would like to compromise some of our systems. So the notion that a coordinated leadership inclusive process that involves all the stakeholders is yet to be done. So I'm suspect of it because in reality, if we don't have all of the parties around the table, then nothing will ever happen.
Meantime, we've got obviously a problem with domestic online hate. In the aftermath of the shooting in El Paso, we learned that the shooter allegedly posted a manifesto on the online messaging platform 8chan. You actually sent a letter to the owner of 8chan calling on him to testify. What do you want to hear from him, and what do you think the problems with the platform are?
Well, you know, the platform is that it's being used to push out so much of this terrorist, right-wing terrorist-inspired philosophy. You know, I'm a civil rights, civil liberties advocate, but I do understand that there are some things, given the times we are in, that we have to monitor, and some things in the interest of keeping America safe, we have to not allow over our cybersecurity systems and platforms. So we contacted 8chan, and they, as you know, have already pulled the platform down. We've been in communication with the owner, and I'm happy to report that we are creating an opportunity to get information from him, whether it will be a committee meeting or a session with the attorneys present. But it appears that we're getting general agreement that there will be discussion between the Homeland Security Committee and the owners of 8chan.
All right. Now, the president has called on federal agencies to work with social media companies to try to identify shooters before they pull the trigger, really putting the onus on social media companies. He's talked about mental illness, but he has not talked about the role of guns in these mass shootings. What kind of work and blame do you think the government shoulders here? And what about the social media companies themselves in terms of combating online violence?
Well, there's no question that we have to have those companies actively engage in monitoring their systems. It's no secret that they have been lax in their general oversight. We have been attempting to get the amount of investment those companies have been putting into their systems of monitoring, and we have yet to get that information back. So we are not certain from that perspective that enough is being done because we've yet to receive accurate information. Now, we have been told that the companies are now aggressively monitoring what is being put on their platform, but that's still not enough. The transparency of what that process includes, they have not shared it with members of Congress. So there's a need for the companies to step up, but there's also a need for members of Congress to put together what we think would be required, to be honest with you, in terms of gun legislation and domestic terrorism. We have to do something about the military-style assault weapons that permeate most of these killings and make them illegal. We have to put in waiting periods for the purchase of guns. We have to make sure that individuals don't have disqualifying illnesses, and that we have to follow that. But as you know, right, one of the first things this administration did was to do away with an Obama-era policy that prohibited people on with medical disabilities in terms of mental health from acquiring weapons. So now they can. So the president is speaking one way, but his administration is doing away with policies that have prohibited certain mental health illnesses, individuals from owning guns. So the president has to listen to the American people rather than the NRA. And I am convinced, based on the polling, that a number of people, substantial majority of people in this country, around 70%, are wanting to do away with the assault weapons that are sold in this country, and they would absolutely support a ban.
Now, Congressman, while I have you, CNN is reporting that the White House has drafted an executive order that would put the FCC in charge of how social media companies like Facebook and Twitter moderate their online content. Do you have any knowledge of this executive order or think this is a good idea?
Well, you know, up to this point, the administration has been relatively silent on this area. I would like to see the executive order, but it would have to include at a minimum, what authority, FTC, if that's the entity and they have the authority, to require those entities to do certain things. I think it's a stretch. We have in Congress historically acknowledged that cybersecurity is a vulnerability. Many of those platforms are not robust enough, but we've never looked at the Federal Trade Commission as the solution. We've always acknowledged from an intelligence gathering standpoint that cybersecurity has to be robust in order to be effective. And as I said, without the leadership from the White House, without somebody in the White House with this responsibility, it will just get passed on from acting person to acting person, and that's been the challenge. The president can't do it all.
Congressman Benny Thompson of Mississippi, thank you so much for taking the time to chat with us today. Appreciate hearing your views here on the show. Coming up, Amazon's Alexa caught in a controversy. Why a Chinese factory for Echoes and Kindles is now facing an investigation. And we're live streaming on Twitter. You can check us out there. Be sure to follow our global breaking news network as well. TikTok, on Twitter. This is Bloomberg. Amazon is under fire again after a major contractor allegedly refused to obey labor laws and slashed wages. Labor advocacy group China Labor Watch accused the company of overusing high school interns and forcing employees to work overtime beyond legal limits. Foxconn makes Amazon's Echo and Kindle e-readers in China. The company said in a statement Friday it had dismissed the plant's chief and head of human resources and punished the managers responsible. Two recent mass shootings in the United States have prompted ESPN to delay this weekend's scheduled broadcast of a video game competition. Apex Legends is a game made by Electronic Arts that features gun violence. President Trump said earlier this week that video games glorifying violence could be contributing to the shooting epidemic. Bloomberg has learned the tape segment will be aired in October. We'll have more of Bloomberg Technology coming up, diving into the China-U.S. trade war. More of that after this quick break. This is Bloomberg. This is Bloomberg Technology. I'm Emily Chang in San Francisco. President Trump fanned trade war flames anew Friday, suggesting that next month's talks with China may not happen. As he left the White House, Trump told reporters that while the two countries have an open dialogue, the U.S. is not ready to make a deal.
What's happening with China now, we have an open dialogue. We'll see whether or not we keep our meeting in September. If we do, that's fine. If we don't, that's fine. But it's time that somebody does what we're doing.
The president also responded to calls for the U.S. to intervene in the currency market. The president saying he has no plans to devalue the dollar. This after the administration formally named China a currency manipulator this week as the yuan sank to its weakest point since 2008. Joining us to discuss, TCW Managing Director and former U.S. Treasury Senior Coordinator for China Affairs, David Lovinger. David, what do you think of the U.S. strategy, the president's strategy thus far?
Yeah, so I think the U.S. has been pursuing a strategy of if we just dial up enough pain and we browbeat the Chinese, that at some point they're going to cry uncle. And so far it hasn't worked.
Will it work?
I don't think it's going to work. I think if you want to promote positive change in China, you need to work with your other trading partners and allies, and you need to focus. You can't kind of take a sawed-off shotgun approach. You need to really focus on the issues that are most important to U.S. national security and the U.S. economy.
So it seems like both sides are digging in. I mean, at this point, Is there any going back? I mean, how hopeful are you for a deal?
Yeah, so I'm not that hopeful. I think you're absolutely right. There is a big deficit problem in U.S.-China relations. It's not the trade deficit, it's the trust deficit. Neither side thinks the other side is negotiating in good faith and will stick to its commitments. That's why right now the U.S. is saying, China, you buy U.S. agricultural products first, and the Chinese are saying you fix Huawei first.
So what do you think about these latest currency moves? You've got China hawks pushing for the U.S. to manipulate its currency. You've got the U.S. calling China a currency manipulator, but at least there we heard the president, stopping short of going further.
Yeah, so on, the whole manipulation question, I guess the issue is after you've already thrown the kitchen sink at China, and essentially that's what we've done with all these tariff and tech sanctions, what's left, I guess you call them names. I mean, compared to what we've already done, calling them a currency manipulator is kind of like flogging them with a wet noodle. Though I do think it raises the risk of currency wars going forward. I'm not that worried about naming China a currency manipulator. I'm very worried that our Commerce Department is going to start slapping on tariffs on countries that they say have undervalued currencies.
Interesting. Take a listen to some additional commentary from the president on devaluing the dollar. Take a listen.
No, we don't have to. We have such a strong dollar. The problem is our dollar's at a level that it makes it hard, but the advantage to doing what we have is money is pouring in because we have the safest currency in the world. We have the standard of the world.
How is this impacting U.S. credibility around the world?
Yeah, so I think when you call China a currency manipulator, and really there's no basis for it. If they were doing anything in the last year, they've been trying to keep the currency from weakening. I think they stepped back from that a bit, but this was clearly a market-led move. So I think when there were times when you could have called China a currency manipulator, but now's not the time. And when the U.S. does something like this, it loses credibility.
All right. Well, we'll continue to cover every drumbeat as they unfold. TCW Managing Director David Levenger, thank you so much for your thoughts. All right, sticking with trade, the Bloomberg New Economy Forum comes to Beijing later this year. In the lead up, we held a special event here in San Francisco to talk about the evolving U.S.-China trade tensions. I spoke with cybersecurity expert Sam Sachs, UCSD professor Susan Shirk, Asia Society Chair Ken Wilcox, and the SVP of Huawei, Joy Tan. We talked about the U.S. ban on Huawei, and I asked Tan about the safety and security of Huawei equipment as well as ties to the Chinese government. Take a listen.
We never had a single major security incident. So we have a proven track record. And we actually opened ourselves up for testing in the UK, in Germany, in Canada. And all these governments are satisfied with our products and solutions. So there's a proven mechanism that can work.
Emily, can I jump in there? Because I would argue, I think there is national security risk from Huawei, but I think that the answer is not, let's dismantle the company. And I think that there are a number of different risks that are often confused. And if we're going to come up with a solution, we can't muddy those risks.
What can you say to convince us, to convince the United States government that the Chinese government doesn't have a backdoor into your company when they work with other private tech companies across China? Ken.
I'm skeptical, and I'm skeptical because in my experience in China, the distinction between private companies and public companies is largely a fiction. I think it's a question of the Chinese government utilizing our terminology, the distinction between private and public, in order to, in a sense, mislead us a little bit. I believe that functionally, if a private company becomes large enough, it's functionally going to resemble in many, many ways an SOE.
So here's a question. Does the White House have a point? Can the U.S. protect national security and continue to have a strong relationship with China?
I think it can. It really depends on how we define the domain of national security. You know, former Secretary of Defense Robert Gates, in talking about export controls, he said what you want is a small yard and high fence. Okay, small yard means not every advanced technology. Probably, I mean, it wouldn't include, for example, advanced manufacturing necessarily. It wouldn't necessarily include biotech and development of cancer drugs. It wouldn't include all of AI necessarily. So you have to, I think, have a more limited definition of the technologies that China's developing through various indigenous efforts and through trying to get advanced technologies from the rest of the world, the ones that are going directly into making the People's Liberation Army and the Chinese military more capable. But if you don't put some boundaries and have a small yard, then basically we're engaged in technological protectionism, technological containment of China, and definitely the folks in China, that's the way they see this. They think that we're just doing everything we can to slow them down, to slow down their progress in order to maintain our own superior position.
My discussion for a special broadcast for the Bloomberg New Economy, a community of global leaders engaging with the world's most significant changes and challenges. You can watch the full conversation tonight, 9 p.m. Eastern, 6 p.m. Pacific, right here on Bloomberg Television. Coming up, Facebook, YouTube, Twitter, the 3 social media platforms of choice for extremists. We'll talk to 2 experts about how that can be stopped. Next, this is Bloomberg. Now, our continuing coverage of combating online extremism. As we discussed earlier, the White House hosted a summit with tech companies on this subject. We know that 2 companies in particular were there, Facebook and Twitter. And according to the University of Maryland, those are 2 of the top 3 social media platforms used by U.S. extremist groups and individuals. To discuss in New York, I want to bring in Jennifer Greigel, professor of social media at Syracuse University's SI Newhouse School of Public Communications. And in Atlanta, we've got Jim Hayes, vice president at Guidepost Solutions. Before that, he was a special agent in charge of Homeland Security Investigations New York field office. So, Jim, as somebody who's worked in federal law enforcement, do meetings like this accomplish much?
I think they can. I think what the administration is trying to do, and many administrations, the past several, as we've seen an increase in social media use, is trying to implore the technology companies about how important it is, the platform that they provide, and the information that could be shared on there that's detrimental, and in certain cases could provide an exigency if someone is making threats, making statements that could imply that they're going to take a violent action. So I think certainly talking to these companies is helpful, and trying to continue and foster that collaboration is something that's absolutely necessary. Whether or not it leads to any substantive actions today, next week, I think building that relationship is critical.
So, Jennifer, when looking at the origin of some of these mass shootings, how much do you think social media is to blame for letting online extremism and violence run rampant? How much is perhaps the president to blame? You know, critics have said he has fanned the flames of some of these behaviors, and how much of this is unfortunate human nature?
I think a lot of the discussion has been about the platforms, Facebook, Twitter, Reddit, 4chan, 8chan. And I think a little bit of that is a distraction. We need to focus more on internet memes, which are, you know, how this ideology and rhetoric that the president has been pushing out over these platforms gets transmitted amongst people. This is how ideas spread. So we've been talking a lot about the platforms, but I think we need to talk about some of the ideas as well. And, you know, I think the White House meetings today, again, are important for collaboration, but we can't be distracted about the messages that are also transmitted over the social media platforms.
Without getting too graphic, what kind of ideas and messages are you talking about?
These are some of the internet memes that are related to immigration, but it could also be some of the concepts such as fake news. Even textual language is a meme. So this idea, that the free press doesn't play an important role here in the United States, that's also a problematic, ideology, I would say, in rhetoric that doesn't support, democracy here in the United States.
Jim, how much of that would you echo, given how much the internet has changed the way that law enforcement needs to fight some of these issues, and now companies need to fight some of these issues to perhaps prevent them before they happen?
Well, I think Jennifer's right in that there is certainly within social media the, proportion of negative information, and certainly can have an environment where like-minded people are encouraging each other to take certain types of actions. But one thing that we can't get away from is the concept of personal accountability. And when it comes to people who are committing these mass shootings, committing violent acts, the stabbing act in Los Angeles just a couple of days ago, we have to first look at the attacker. We have to look at the fact that this is something that person did, that they're responsible for. And I think as a society, we're really losing the concept of personal accountability. Everything seems to be someone else's fault. When I look at who's at fault primarily for these incidents, it's the people who committed them.
Jennifer, how do you respond to that as somebody who looks at the broader ecosystem and how that impacts society?
Yeah, I want to echo some of what Jim is saying too, is that at the end of the day, we saw in the wake of the Russian, kind of election interference, a lot of attention on internet memes and what we were calling, kind of media literacy, this idea of fake news, and that we just had to know what we were reading. I'd like to call on increasing importance of understanding this concept of influence and persuasion, and allowing internet memes and memetics to kind of come into our mind, into our life, the stuff that we think about and the things that we share. So again, it's part of the personal responsibility is just about being like a good human, and it involves the stuff that we consume, but also what we share and who we look up to and who our mentors are, and also who we elect to lead our country.
Meantime, Jim, do you think that the federal government should police social media companies?
Well, I don't know that I would say that is what the federal government's role should be. I know that the companies themselves have policies about what type of content, especially, unfortunately, their newer policies and their policies out of necessity. I do think media plays a role. I remember classes in high school and college that talked about what was yellow journalism in the 1920s. And unfortunately, in my career in law enforcement, I learned pretty early on in my career that what you're reading in a particular newspaper, periodical, now what you're seeing on the internet, there's a point of view. There's a point of view that certain media organizations drive, depending on their ideology. And I think it's important for people to understand that, and unfortunately not take at face value what you're reading. People have to do their own research, and people have to, I think more now than ever, really make up their own minds and not just believe what's being put in front of them. And I think that sometimes is something that's lost as well.
Now, all of this said, Jennifer, the president seems to want the federal government to help social media companies identify potential shooters before they pull the trigger. Is that realistic?
Well, I'm glad Jim was referencing, kind of studies in university. I teach social listening at Syracuse University. I teach, kind of being able to monitor and listen for news stories and journalism based on keywords and things like that. And I study content moderation. We talk about that in the classroom too. And at the end of the day, we also talk about regulation and corporate citizenship and how they're interconnected, because unfortunately the regulatory environment for Facebook and other companies is so light that they really don't have to engage in good business practices right now. So we've been talking about raising the bar, what we need to see from our regulators here in the United States, how they're behind, how Europe has been leading the way, and how there's really a risk to society until we have social media and platforms kind of come into some of the media governance and oversight and regulatory structures that we've seen in legacy media like broadcast, like we see in radio. Right now, platforms and social media are getting a big exemption, and it's deeply problematic.
All right, Jennifer Greigel of Syracuse University, Jim Hayes of Guidepost Solutions. Obviously a debate we will continue to have. Thank you both. Still ahead, Broadcom is taking a second chance on Symantec. Just months after a full merger fell apart, the chipmaker buying Symantec's enterprise division, the one serving business customers. Details on that deal next. This is Bloomberg. Broadcom agreed to buy Symantec's enterprise division for over $10 billion in cash. The deal expected to close in Broadcom's fiscal first quarter, ending in January, and it comes less than a month after discussions for a full merger fell apart over disagreements over price. To discuss, we are joined by Bloomberg Tech's Ian King, and with us on the phone, Hans Mosesman of Rosenblatt Security, who currently holds a buy rating on Broadcom. So, Ian, tell us how this finally came together.
Yeah, well, I mean, it looks like, they were talking, couldn't get to a price, and then Broadcom finally said, well, how about this particular division? We can see value in it. We can take it off your hands. Symantec had been struggling with that particular division to maintain its growth under a lot of competition, and Broadcom said, we can do a better job, and they came up with an agreeable price.
Hans, what does the deal mean for Broadcom? What does it mean for the chip industry at large?
Well, there's a couple of things going on. For Broadcom, it makes sense. It just makes their infrastructure software business bigger. There's more scale, there's significant synergies, and Symantec brings enterprise security to the fold. For the semi industry, it means, at least for Broadcom, it reduces volatility. Now their business will be nearly 30% not susceptible to the cyclicality of semis, and it still meets their cash flow and gross margin, operating margin target. So I think it's a good deal for them and for the industry.
Meantime, looking at other companies, you've got Intel shares falling this week. You've got what's happening with AMD. How does this change the sort of competitive landscape?
Well, Hans has been promoting AMD for a long time. He's been a big fan of the potential that they have. And I think what we would say is, from the event, they exceeded people's expectations, both in terms of the customers that they rolled out on stage, particularly Google, and they made some promises around performance and price, which are going to be very, very difficult for Intel to stomach in its most profitable market, which is servers. If AMD is, capable of executing on its promises, it's going to be really tough for Intel for a while.
AMD shares on a tear, Hans. What's necessary to keep that up?
Well, now they have to deliver. I think, number one, I was surprised that the performance improvement relative to Intel's best today. It's about twice the performance. That is huge. It's never happened in the history of silicon and CPUs. And I don't think that Intel has a roadmap for the next several years that could even match that. So there are significant repercussions in terms of market share. I think that AMD is going to easily surpass the 25% market share that they reached back in 2006. And by the same token, this is a zero-sum game. The Intel business model is going to be pressured like it has never been pressured before. So very good things for AMD coming up ahead, depending on execution. I think they will, and a tough environment for Intel.
Right. How much does this depend on the China-U.S. trade war not escalating? I mean, it certainly doesn't look like there's going to be a deal anytime soon, Hans. What does that mean for these companies?
Well, I mean, that's a challenge for the entire industry, and it's independent of the market share trends between AMD and Intel. It is a challenge for the industry. I think we've, as analysts, been trying to kind of eliminate at least the Huawei component to a lot of our models, but it is a significant problem in terms of management's ability to kind of forecast even within the next quarter because of this uncertainty. So it's stressful and a dynamic that hopefully it will not continue, but it's something to watch, and it's a negative.
So, Ian, what are you watching for the rest of the year?
Well, exactly what Hans was just talking about. I mean, we're watching for the next tweet, frankly. In the middle of July, we had a meeting where the chip industry CEOs went to the White House. Seemed like they were coming away with what they wanted: the licenses, the ability to deal with Huawei, the ability to move forward. And fast forward to this week when we expected those licenses to be handed over, and we're left reporting the fact that it doesn't look like that's going to happen. It looks like the politics has got in the way. I mean, this is dominating everything. This is the largest market for semiconductors. If you're an American chip company, you have to be in China. You have to have access to that market. Anything that threatens that, you're in trouble.
All right, Bloomberg's Ian King and Hans Mosesmann, thank you so much. Obviously a lot to watch, especially as the trade war continues to evolve. Meantime, I've got some quick news about WeWork. They are said to unveil their IPO filing as soon as this week. Obviously, we knew WeWork was planning to go public soon, possibly as early as September. We will bring you more news on that as we have it. Stick with Bloomberg. That does it for this edition of Bloomberg Technology. This is Bloomberg.